Emerald Fennell's Wuthering Heights compresses a complex literary classic into a lascivious teenager's daydream. Whether you're seeing the film for a faithful adaptation or just for a bit of escapism, your opinion will differ greatly. I want to start this off by saying I am not a die-hard Emily Brontë fan. I only just read Wuthering Heights like 2 weeks ago. Don't get me wrong, I love period dramas, interesting historical books and movies, but I am by no means a literary classicist. I definitely love reading. I am more of a high fantasy reader. Reading Wuthering Heights kind of brought me back to my teenage days when I had to read Romeo and Juliette at school and Dracula. So I actually found it really helpful listening to the audiobook than I did actually physically reading the book, especially for Joseph's parts, because I really struggled with the translation of his northern accent. So highly recommend the audiobook. Like many people right now in the world, they are reading or like me listening to Wuthering Heights for the first time in preparation for Emerald Fennell's adaptation. I also watched a few of the adaptations many years ago. I watched the Tom Hardy and Charlotte Riley one. And more recently, in the last few weeks, I've watched the Ralph Fiennes and Juliette Binoche version, as well as the 2011 version with, I think it's James Howson and Kea Scodelario. I've also listened to a bunch of podcasts and done a heap of research, all in preparation to see the actual film, which I saw last Friday, which is 5 days ago now. So I've had time to think about it. So this is all fresh in my mind and ready to talk about. I'm not one of those people who read Wuthering Heights when they were a teenager and do have this romanticized version of it in my head where I kind of only focus on the love story and forget about all the socio-political things that were happening in the book. Let me read you this quote that Emerald Fennell gave to Time magazine. She said, "I wanted to make something that made me feel like I felt when I first read it, which means that this is an emotional response to something. It's like primal, sexual. I know that if somebody else made it, I'd be furious. It's very personal material for everyone. It's very illicit. The way we relate to the characters is very private, I think." So this is what she said to Time magazine, which when you see the film, you can absolutely understand that she's picked specifically the love story or implied erotic nature of it and kind of ran with that. The problem is when you look at something the way that you saw it as a teenager, we lose so much context. As a teenager, what are your priorities at the time? You're thinking about relationships and the opposite sex or the same sex, whatever. But the fact is that you're focused on passion and love and sex and thinking about those types of things. So you're not going to be listening to the intertextual references or reading into the things that the author is really trying to translate through their characters and their situations and their motivations. We're just focusing on Heathcliff and thinking, oh, he's so broody and dark and troubled and mysterious. And oh my God, Kathy is so freaking annoying. She needs to shut up and just like try and do the right thing. But also she's such a rebellious little wildling. What the hell is Joseph talking about? I have no idea. Mainly for me is I wish I could smash Hindley's face in. We don't see the social, gothic, political, patriarchal, abusive topics that Brontë was trying to convey through her characters, their actions and their mistakes. So because I have absorbed this book as an adult within the context of modern society, as well as having an understanding of what the British Empire were doing at that point in time that Emily was alive, I can understand the impact and the intensity of the topics that she was trying to talk about in the novel. And I can understand why so many people are up in arms about the latest version. Now, if you sit in either of those camps, whether you're a long-time die-hard fan of Brontë or you're a newbie who has no idea what everyone's so pissed off about, I've actually created a carousel post on my Instagram talking about essentially the basic plot line of Wuthering Heights, the family tree, the narration style with Nelly and Mr. Lockwood, and the top 10 themes in the novel, which are obviously vital to when you use an original text and then you turn it into an adaptation. You kind of need to know what the source material is that you're working with. So I will link that in the description box below and you can flip through that. Even now, if you want to do that before we go into the rest of the film review. Okay, racial aspect, let's get into it. There's been a lot of heated discourse around the fact that Heathcliff has been cast as a non-person of colour. with casting Jacob Elordi. Don't get me wrong, Jacob Elordi apparently has some Spanish descent in his ethnicity. Great. But what we know about Wuthering Heights is that Heathcliff is quite clearly described as dark-skinned and dark-haired. Even Nelly, the narrator, the housemaid, companion of Cathy, she is getting Heathcliff dressed in one moment and she is saying to him, who knows about your mother, and your father could have been a Chinese emperor and your mother could have been an Indian queen. So through that, we're getting a real visual representation of what Heathcliff looks like. It's quite obvious that he is a person of colour. As much as people want to debate about it, you guys can go and research it and have a look at it yourselves, but really just think about it for a second. This is what is actually happening. I 100% fully believe that Heathcliff is a person of colour. It also sets up his motivations, his vengeance, his resentment. It all makes sense once you actually bring that context into it. Heathcliff's otherness, with a capital O, is the crux, the hinge pin, the core of his motivations. His resentments, his hatred, his vengeance, and part of his obsessive and possessive love of Cathy. You got to put in context what Heathcliff has been through as a child up until this point. Complete abuse, abandonment, racial segregation because of how he looks. He can't really talk proper English. He cannot read or write. And Cathy is the only person who shows him any sort of love or companionship or friendship. Of course, he's going to want to hold on to her at any cost. Now, let me tell you something. If Fennell had swapped the actors of Edgar and Heathcliff, instantly the film is 1,000 times better, okay? Look at Shazad Latif. He is the perfect Heathcliff. My goodness. He is half Pakistani, and then I think he's Scottish and British on the other side of his lineage. So in actual fact, when you think about Heathcliff's origins and where Mr. Earnshaw found him in Liverpool, it's highly likely that he would have been half British, half another Eastern culture. I feel like he would have been such an incredible Heathcliff. And I feel like in the film, they made him look, obviously, as Edgar, they made him look quite prim and proper and stuff. But look at this photo of him. He would have been such a perfect, rugged Heathcliff. Oh, that's another conversation. I feel like we should start a petition to reshoot the movie with Shazad Latif as Heathcliff. Anyway, say they had cast him as Heathcliff. Even just if they'd have kept the movie exactly as it is, but swapped him into the role of Heathcliff, it would have already been 1,000 times better because the racial aspect of it would have been implied. Even if they hadn't have gone deep into a play-by-play of people being racist towards him, violent towards him because of his race, it would have been inferred. So it would have already given the audience an understanding of where all of that hatred and abuse kind of stemmed from. Or another theory, was Edgar swapped to be played by an actor of colour and Heathcliff wasn't, because it was kind of like they were trying to make sure the villain was not a person of colour and the good guy in Edgar was a person of colour? I don't know, that's like an interesting theory that I've read out there. But alas, Fennell did not, because apparently it's all about star power, particularly 6'5" star power. Here's me thinking that Wuthering Heights is kind of like just fan fiction, but maybe it's just like Jacob Elordi fan fiction, because I know that Emerald Fennell is kind of a little bit obsessed with Jacob Elordi. Apparently he didn't even need to audition for the film. She actually just like texted him and was like, do you want this role? Because it's yours if you want it. Moving on. Hindley, oh my God. No, Hindley. Hindley, the evil, drunk, abusive, violent, hate-filled Hindley, the older brother of Cathy, was just not in the film. He was kind of amalgamated with her father, Mr. Earnshaw. And even then, it wasn't anywhere near as violent and graphic as the novel or even previous adaptations, showing the level of violence that Heathcliff was subjected to in his childhood. Hindley is really the villain of the story, right? He is the villain who created the monster being Heathcliff, and Heathcliff is only like that because of what he went through as a child. It's actually kind of giving like Dr. Frankenstein and Frankenstein's monster vibe. Actually, hang on a second. Also, what is it with Jacob Elordi and choosing two very similar characters that have quite a few parallels? I'm talking Heathcliff and Frankenstein's monster. Both are monsters created by cruelty and neglect of those around them, but driven by that desperate need for love and acceptance that, really in the end just transforms into a destructive rage that destroys everything around them as well as themselves and any sort of capacity for love. Anyway, Hindley Earnshaw specifically represents the abusive power of the landed class, as essentially he attempts to reduce Heathcliff to the status of a servant. This power dynamic is essential to the plotline, genuinely essential. So by removing him from the story, where do Heathcliff's motivations come from? Where does his resentment come from? Where does his rage come from? Removal of Hindley's intense hate and abuse subsequently removes Heathcliff's vengeance, resentment, and motivations. We lose so much depth and complexity to the story already. And because Hindley is gone, that means Hareton is gone. Hareton is essentially Hindley's son. So Hindley married a woman called Frances, and they had a son called Hareton. Sweet, poor Hareton. Really, he is the redemptive sweetheart of the novel. That's what I think anyway. Now, in case you didn't know, originally Wuthering Heights was a 2-volume story. The first volume, which is the story of Cathy and Heathcliff. And then you've got the second volume, which is the story of Hareton and young Cathy. So young Cathy is Cathy and Edgar's daughter, who they also call Cathy because that's not confusing enough. So they're like the next gen. When Emily Brontë passed away, her sister Charlotte ended up combining the 2 volumes into one story. However, in Emerald Fennell's film, the second part of the story is just like gone. So already we're losing 50% of the novel, and if not the best part of it, because it's the redemptive arc, but I'll get into that later. Essentially, Cathy and Heathcliff represent what not to do in a relationship. They represent a destructive type of love. Whereas Hareton and young Cathy, yes, they're cousins, but it was like totally normal to marry your cousin back then. They teach the reader about the moral of the story. And in actual fact, towards the end of the book, they teach Heathcliff about what potentially could have been had him and Cathy had a more healthy relationship that wasn't just like a trauma bond based in an abusive childhood together, which then in fact actually makes Heathcliff kind of release all of his revenge and his violent need to just kind of make everyone miserable. That's kind of the hinge pin that makes him just let it all go towards the end, is seeing Hareton and Cathy find this kind of restorative love instead of a destructive love that him and Cathy had. By removing the whole second volume of the story, we are completely removing the redemption arc from the whole thing. And it's kind of like, well, you watch the movie and you're like, what was the point of that? Like, what did I learn? Not much. And that whole second part of the novel is the only part of Wuthering Heights that feels somewhat positive or hopeful or sweet. So by removing that, it just feels like just purely miserable. Isabella. Isabella is Edgar's sister, and she actually ends up marrying Heathcliff in the novel. Not because they love each other. Heathcliff just does it just to piss Cathy off, essentially. But it's interesting how Emerald Fennell has changed Isabella's story within the movie. So in the novel, she is a innocent, naive young lady who's kind of mystified and entranced by Heathcliff's dark and brooding and somewhat crazy manner. So she goes from being a naive, innocent young lady to being hoodwinked into a marriage, essentially, and then abused and degraded, but then eventually becomes an independent woman. And then she dies, because obviously they all die. A lot of them die. It's a gothic novel. Death is just like the number one theme in it. She marries Heathcliff, and he verbally and repeatedly says to her, I do not love you. I am purely marrying you to get your wealth, to annoy Cathy, etc. And she suffers severe domestic abuse in that relationship. However, in the film, it's kind of been flipped on its head. Isabella's jealousy of Cathy and her idolatry and attraction to Heathcliff pushes her to knowingly become and want to become his submissive and almost co-conspirator in tormenting Cathy in multiple degrading situations. There's a whole bedroom scene where essentially Heathcliff climbs into her bedroom. He says, I do not love you. I will hurt you. But after each statement he makes, he says, do you want me to stop? To which she kind of just like shakes her head like no, like she's kind of enjoying it. And this whole dynamic swap made me really confused. on one hand, I can see that she's taking agency because she is enjoying it, and hats off to her, like whatever, enjoy it, that's fine. Then there's another moment where she's sitting at a table at Wuthering Heights and her and Heathcliff are kind of like writing letters to Cathy together. He's trying to get her to convey how abused she is and miserable she is. So then that kind of hopefully motivates Cathy to come and visit and be like, what is going on? And then Heathcliff gets to see her again. But there's an interesting shot where Isabella is just sitting at the table and Heathcliff is kind of like kneeling down next to her. It's almost like they're two children who are trying to create a ploy to bully another kid into paying attention to them. That's what it felt like to me. So I kind of liked how Fennell changed that dynamic in that one sense where the power dynamic isn't what it is in the novel, which is, pretty much a reflection of reality for women at that period in time. And I liked how it was like she was taking agency and like that was what she, was enjoying, like good on her, but whatever. But at the core of me, I know that Isabella's role in the novel is extremely vital for communicating Emily Bronte's perspective on what women were going through at that period in time in a patriarchal society. In the novel, Isabella was a woman who was coerced into a marriage, then abused, then somehow found the strength, while pregnant with her abuser's child, mind you, to flee by herself to London, somehow make a living for herself, for her and her child, only for her then to die at some point, for her child to then go back to be with her abuser, to then be abused himself while he was actually ill, and then he subsequently dies while he's trying to fulfill Heathcliff's revenge plan against young Cathy and Hareton and Edgar, and it's just, horrendous, right? Horrendous, but important. In Emily Bronte's eyes, Isabella's role represents the vulnerability of women in a patriarchal society. Her character arc demonstrates what happens when you follow blind, naive passion and then how it can lead to ruin. Nelly, the definition of an unreliable narrator. In the novel, pretty much everything is told from her perspective because Mr. Lockwood comes to rent Thrushcross Grange, talk about a tongue twister, and he essentially gets Nelly to recount the history of the two places there and Wuthering Heights, and to tell him essentially about his crazy grumpy neighbour, which is just a really old Heathcliff. So she's recounting all of these stories. So already within the novel, we are being told by Emily Brontë, this is one person's perspective and it's always going to be biased. Now, to understand that it is done through one person's perspective is really essential to understanding the moral of the story. The film, however, portrays Nelly as essentially the bastard daughter of a lord. So she is not as lowly as a servant. She is kind of positioned as a companion for Cathy. But it also helps us understand already the kind of resentful mechanisms that motivate her to obstruct, distort, and at other times just blatantly steer characters in different directions. Her resentment towards Cathy is kind of crystal clear. We can see that she is always reading in the movie. She's very put together, even just like her dress and her hair and her makeup, the way she sits, the way she presents herself is very put together. So she is having to adhere to these social structures very strictly, whereas Cathy can just kind of like run free through the moors, wear what she wants, have her hair out and wild and tangled. And you can kind of understand Nelly's resentment already to Cathy. So instead of Nelly just telling the story, she's actively engineering the tragic outcome of Cathy and Heathcliff by intercepting letters, orchestrating what's heard in believed moments of secrecy between her and Cathy, and essentially acting as a central force in the downfall of Cathy and Heathcliff's relationship. I didn't mind this reimagining of Nelly because I think it kind of gave me a new perspective of her that I was already moving towards in the book. The book felt too much that she was depicting herself as this kind of innocent bystander in this story, when I know by reading it, listening to it, that she definitely wasn't. And the film kind of gave me an interesting perspective of her that actually gave me a little bit more depth to her character. So that was one part that I did enjoy. Now, as we talk about this, obviously there's going to be an argument as to Emerald Fennell obviously being a female director, and that we are, as a society, always more critical and harsh on women doing their thing. But I just want to say, if this film had been made by a man, I would be going 1000% more savage on it than I am right now. If anything, I was hoping Fennell would be more capable of doing this film justice because she is a woman. I feel like Emily Brontë being a woman, her being a woman, both women who are essentially working in a male-dominated sphere. Emily Brontë, the world of writing, and Emerald Fennell, the world of directing. So wouldn't you feel this intense feeling of responsibility to do the original text justice? Now, Emerald Fennell made a comment that I find kind of sums up what we're seeing on the screen. She said, Emily Bronte's novel is very dense and complicated and difficult, and explained that a direct, faithful adaptation is not possible. I vehemently disagree. I have seen a couple of adaptations that have captured the essence of the story really well. I am all for destigmatizing and promoting women's desire and sex lives. I'm all for that. I believe they should be celebrated in all their varying forms. However, not when it means also promoting abusive, toxic, violent relationships, codependent love stories that are really just the product of two people surviving a violent and abusive childhood, which essentially is a trauma bond, not a loving relationship. You can argue with me on what the definition of love is, but it's not a healthy relation. Anyway, it's not something that we should be promoting to younger audiences or just any audience. We already have enough issues in the world than promoting violent relationships. I get that love is not all rainbows and sunshine. I actually saw Jacob Elordi saying how we should be talking about the multifaceted aspects of love and that it's not always rainbows and sunshine. But like, when you have a position in the world that you can communicate to millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people, these types of things, you have a responsibility to do it in a way that, yes, okay, if it is toxic and abusive and awful and violent, to showcase it in a way where we're not promoting it. We are, yes, showing that there are versions of love that are awful and horrendous, and the moral of the story is to not do that, to actually do what Kathy and Hareton do and be kind to each other and grow together and be forgiving and vulnerable. You have to give context to these things. You can't just say, this is a violent, toxic, abusive, obsessive, possessive, yes, passionate love story, but we're not promoting it as go out and find that and that's great. As long as he's 6'5" and like kind of cute, then it's totally fine. We need to be giving context to these things, especially if you're using a foundational text. There needs to be context. Also, releasing it on the eve of Valentine's Day, the whole promotional tour, I was like, what is happening? This is not a love story. Now, with regards to the raunchiness and the sexiness of the film, here are my thoughts. I don't think Fennell picked a side. From the trailers and snippets that we got through the promotional lead up to the film's release, it felt like it was going to be so much more erotic than it actually ended up being. There was no nudity. A lot of like the sexual scenes, they were implied. Maybe they just didn't have great chemistry, but yeah, it just didn't feel like the vibe of the trailers. I felt like the vibe of the trailers was way more interesting than the actual film was itself. So I feel like she didn't fully dive deep into that aspect. And then on the other hand, she could have gone down the more typical period piece route where it is a lot of implied tension, you know, like Pride and Prejudice, the hand flex scene I've talked about in my previous video, understanding the context of that historical time. You know what touching another person's hand was when they weren't wearing a glove, or you didn't have a social reason to be touching their hands and you go, oh, that's just scandalous. That wasn't happening either because it was just like blatantly showing them having sex. It was just like, what is happening? Now, I had a thought the other day as I've learned more about Emerald Fennell's kind of elite, wealthy, privileged upbringing. Her father is a famous jeweler in England, obviously. He's named his daughter Emerald, so that kind of makes sense. But I had this theory that maybe the reason for the way that she's approached this film is a form of method directing. Stay with me. There are interconnecting threads to the way that she has approached this film, and then to the character of Cathy Earnshaw. Both of them seem to pick and choose the aspects of reality that they want to interact with, and then they disregard the rest. Fennell was choosing to adapt Wuthering Heights through the lens of her horny teenage self, and then to cast Heathcliff as a white, non-person of colour actor whose racial story has just kind of been removed. And then also choosing to exaggerate other aspects of the novel, which obviously, in my opinion, have been interpreted in quite a dangerous way. And then marketing the film as the greatest love story ever told. It does more than just dilute the novel. It reframes it in a way that can actually be quite dangerous. Something that would have Emily Brontë rolling in her grave. Now, this interconnecting thread with Cathy's character. Now, Cathy chooses to blind herself to the consequences of her decisions, picking and choosing the parts of reality that she will and will not come to terms with. She refuses to acknowledge that she cannot reconcile her passionate, wild love for Heathcliff with the civilized, socially advantageous marriage to Edgar. She refuses to understand the impact that marrying Edgar will have on Heathcliff. She refuses to see Heathcliff as cruel, vengeful, and resentful when he returns. So, in a way, could Fennell actually be hoodwinking us all? And in actual fact, she is channeling Cathy Earnshaw in her directing style. Maybe not. But it was an interesting way of looking at it, and it helped me process what I was actually feeling watching the movie. At the end of the day, I do not have a problem with adaptations. Clueless is inspired by Emma by Jane Austen. 10 Things I Hate About You is inspired by The Taming of the Shrew by William Shakespeare. Bridget Jones's Diary, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. She's the Man, Twelfth Night by William Shakespeare. The Lion King, Hamlet by William Shakespeare. All incredible films. Are they faithful adaptations? No. Do they capture the essence of the foundational text? Yes. I know things need to be reinterpreted for a modern audience. I also know it's how you interpret it as an individual that really makes the difference. But if you get the fundamental message of the original text wrong, what are you doing? Why do it at all? Call it something else. All of these adaptations that I just listed to you were not called the name of the original text that they based it on. They all had new names. But do not clickbait people into seeing and paying for a film when you cannot be bothered interacting with the foundational text and faithfully distilling the essence and the moral of the story. You are not only doing a disservice to the author and to the legions of fans that come to see it, but you are also distorting the core message to unknowing and new audiences. Or at least say inspired by, not based on, in the credits. At the end of the day, my biggest hope is that no matter how you feel about the film, that this encourages people to interact with the original text and to understand more about Emily Bronte's life and the context of the world that she was living in when she wrote this incredible, layered, devastating novel. Now, the costumes are a whole other thing. I will be going into a deep dive on that in my next video. But yes, so many feelings about this film. Let me know in the comments whether you've seen it, how you felt about it. Did you like it? Did you hate it? I'm fascinated to know. Leave a comment in the comment section. I'm fascinated to hear your opinion. I also have some recommendations for other adaptations. So the 1992 version of Wuthering Heights is with Ralph Fiennes and Juliette Binoche. I think that's one of the closest ones to the original novel that I've watched. I think Ralph Fiennes portrays Heathcliff's vengeance and violence really well in it. And then the fact that Juliette Binoche plays both Cathy Earnshaw and then the young Cathy was kind of trippy, but also gave that continuity of storyline. It kind of made it make sense. The 2009 version, probably like 20 years ago, 15 years ago. So that's got Tom Hardy and Charlotte Riley in it. And I think the main reason that I watched that was because I knew that they kind of fell in love on set and they're still married to this day. But from memory, it was a really good movie as well. So check that one out. Last week, I watched the 2011 version. This is the only version that has actually cast a black actor as Heathcliff. So that's Kaya Scodelario as Cathy, which incredible casting, right? She also has a northern accent in it, which makes it so much more believable. But if you guys are a similar generation to me, she was Effie in Skins. And I felt like her character in Skins, I just imagined her being transported to the Georgian era and just being a little brat in the Yorkshire moors, just like Kathy. I thought it was just like the perfect casting. But that film is definitely a lot more realistic of the reality, the harshness, the almost violent nature of the environment that they were living in at that time, and essentially what the environment that Emily Brontë was living in at that time. So it gives you a real understanding of the harshness. So I really enjoyed that one. That also takes out the second half of the story with Kathy and Hareton, which was kind of disappointing, but I get they've got to condense it into like a film length. So, but what they did do really stayed true to the novel. Now, I also listened to a podcast. A friend recommended me a podcast episode of Betwixt the Sheets, and it was all about the sex and scandal behind Wuthering Heights. I really love that. It was so funny, but also really informative. They talked a lot about Emily Bronte's life, what it was like for her growing up. She had 2 older sisters who died, obviously 2 other sisters, Charlotte Brontë and Anne Brontë, both authors in their own right, and then 1 brother, Branwell Brontë. And it was just fascinating hearing about their kind of family dynamic. Also, the reality of the world that she was living in, like the average age of mortality where she was living was 25 years old. Now, you've got to realize Emily Brontë, she wrote Wuthering Heights, I think she was in her late 20s, and it was only out for a year and then she passed away. Fascinating the dynamic also between her and Charlotte Brontë. Charlotte Brontë wrote Jane Eyre, and Charlotte actually edited Wuthering Heights after Emily passed away. She combined both volumes into one book, but then apparently she also changed a lot of what Joseph was saying, so it was a little bit more understandable to people who were reading it, but who knows what else she kind of edited in there as well. So I found that really interesting. If you want to absorb Wuthering Heights very quickly before you go and see the movie, I highly recommend listening to the audiobook. I listened to it on 1.3 speed, and I think I got it done in like 3-4 days. Mind you, I've got 2 little kids, so I'm constantly doing things, but I had it in my AirPods and I could just get through it. It was great because the narrator actually did all the accents for the different characters, which I felt really gave it a clarity of atmosphere and like intention for what people were saying, how they were saying it. Even Joseph, you can barely understand what he's talking about, but when you hear someone say it, you can get the gist of it so much quicker. So highly recommend that. I've linked that in the description box below too.